and welcome to UTB, our weekly special program. Today, we are going to talk about the 36th ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union and the 42nd ordinary session of the Executive Council that will undertake between February 15 to February 19 in Addis Ababa. For that, I met Adem Kassie from Netherlands Hague. Adem is a senior advisor in peace and the constitution building as the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Adem is also a vice president of the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers. We will raise several issues on the topic today. First of all, Adem, nice to meet you. And on behalf of my institution and my audience, I would like to say thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to join you.
Right, Adem. As I've said earlier, the 36th ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union and the 42nd ordinary session of the Executive Council will undertake it in Addis Ababa. So, based on your experience, I know like you are very expert in analysis of the African topics and issue. So what are basic or major issues that should be underlined or tables for discussions on this session?
Thank you very much again for having me. The African Union has four key objectives, and each of its sessions have historically focused on one or the other, but it's driven by these four objectives. The first one is building a peaceful, stable continent. And in that regard, I suspect that it will be central to the deliberations that will happen in this round of the summit as well. As you may know, there's a lot of conflicts going on, particularly in the East and Horn of Africa, in the Great Lakes region, and of course, big terrorism-related conflict in the Greater Sahel region. And so I suspect that peace and security will be on top of the agenda of the African Union. The African Union also focus on building a shared continent that is necessary for a shared prosperity. And in that regard as well, I think the African Union will also take stock of what has happened so far in terms of bringing the African continental free trade area into reality. It has had a slow start, but there has been steady progress as well. And so they will also take stock of that. And the African Union also has objectives in connection with democratic governance, good governance, and respect for fundamental rights. And I also suspect, particularly in view of the series of coups d'etats that have happened in the past few years, the African Union will also have to deliberate on ways to stem the unconstitutional change of government and how that then contributes to peace and stability. And in this regard, the African peer review mechanism is actually publishing the Africa Governance Report, and the theme for this year is on unconstitutional change of government, and that has been that will then obviously be unveiled and officially launched. And so I suspect the African Union Summit will also focus on that. And finally, of course, the African Union has the objective of bringing the continent together to speak with one voice at the international level. And in this regard, the African Union has been pushing, and there's increasing acceptance of the understanding that the African Union should have a place in the United Nations Security Council. And so the Americans, the Europeans, and also Russia and other countries have now accepted that agenda. And I think they will also probably speak around those issues. And of course, broader issues around climate change, around inclusion, and the theme of the African Union for 2023 is an inclusive Africa. And in that regard, I think they will talk about gender and other poverty and all issues and related issues as well.
Right, Adam, you have explained very well. My next question is, as you have known, like every year, the meeting will undertake in Addis Ababa. Head of states of every country came in Addis Ababa and discuss on various issues, confer on various topics, and deliberate various decisions. So, what are major challenges that spoil or that push back the Union from putting into practice those deliberations? For instance, several pieces and the security problems are rising in different parts of the continent, as you have known. So what makes the Union or what push back the Union from putting into practice such deliberations? This is the first question. And then, what is your recommendations for the future to bring about sustainable peace and security around the continent?
Well, so indeed, I think the African Union is a very ambitious institution. It has huge ambitions in terms of stabilizing the continent, in terms of leading the continent to prosperity, and also democratizing the continent. And of course, also having, building an image as a strong continent. And at the same time, if you look at its mandate, if you look at its institutions, and if you look at its financing, you can see that the ambitions are not matched by its organization and resources. And so that's why you often see a declaration of very, very ambitious agendas and then difficulties complying with. If you look at the African Union, beyond the legitimacy that it is an African institution, it doesn't have a lot of leverage. So it doesn't have a lot of leverage in enforcing its decisions. Countries can generally leave, even if they are not part of the African Union, they can operate generally out of its context. And so I think the fundamental challenge is that its ambition is not matched by its resources, its organization. So that's where the core problem lies in. And of course, not everybody has expectations around it, but they don't always understand how it works and its mandate and it is in institutions. So if we want to enhance, if we want to enhance the African Union and its role, we have to start looking at what kind of mandates does it have? What kind of resources does it have? And what kind of institutions does it have? At the moment, there seems to be a sort of division of labor between the African Union and regional economic communities, where the African Union sets the ambition, but it outsources implementation of these key issues to the regional economic communities, which also face their own challenge. But I think at the African Union level, as well as at the regional economic communities level, the main challenge remains that the ambitions are not matched by the organization and the resources that the continent needs. And that's why often, when it wants to enforce peace, it has to rely on Westerners and other resources to get the resources. And even when it wants to enforce sanctions that it imposes, it has to rely either on regional economic communities or on other countries. And if they don't comply with its call, with its demands or requests for help, then its decisions are not implemented. And so we have to transform the African Union into a genuine union. A lot of people compare it with the European Union, but it's nothing like that. It really doesn't have any enforcing mechanisms. It doesn't have the resources. It doesn't have the leverage to implement decisions. And in this regard, I think if everything goes well with the push to bring the African continental free trade area into life, I think it will enhance the reputation, the place, but also the leverage of the African Union to implement its decisions. But at the moment, it is more a place for setting ambitions, inspiring in African countries and regional economic communities, rather than actually doing it itself directly.
Right. So in terms of peace and the security, several measures have been undertaken by the Union Peace and the Security Body. So which measures do you really admire or hail, or that you recommend that the Union shall work together in the future?
Well, so, the main thing is that the African Union often sets the standards, the normative framework, and those are commendable. I think we have to recognize that. And the African Union also has actively tried to promote peace and stability. For instance, as you know, they were active in trying to find a solution to the civil war in Ethiopia. And they're also involved in trying to find solutions in Sudan, in the Great Lakes region, and everywhere. And so they set norms, but they also try to use their reputation, their legitimacy, to push African countries, African institutions, to find solutions to problems of security, to problems of peace and security. And so they set norms, they encourage, they nudge, they support peaceful initiatives under the African Solutions to African Problems banner. And of course, in some cases, particularly when there have been coups d'etats, the African Union has also imposed sanctions. And of course, one of the challenges of the African Union in regard to unconstitutional change of government is the tendency to focus on the consequences. So they look at coups d'etats and all, and they target and try to address them, but they have often been slow in addressing the root causes in terms of violations of rights, in terms of violations of power, constitutions, and other systems. And so, yes, they are good at setting standards. They are good at encouraging the governments and African institutions to provide and find peaceful solutions to conflicts, but they still have a lot of work to do in terms of identifying the root causes and engaging African countries beyond the idea of state sovereignty, trying to find solutions to the problems that ultimately lead to unconstitutional change of government. But the African Union, I think, overall, as I said, our expectations are high, but it does work. It's a valuable institution, but it needs to transform itself into a genuinely union of the people of Africa and not just the union of incumbents and governments.
All right, moving to the next question. How do you describe the motto African solutions for African problems? Can you please tell us, comparing from the attitude or perspective of the Western side?
Well, so as you know, one of the fundamental mottos at the moment is the African Solutions to African Problems banner. And understandably, as a continent, Africa has always been seen as a subject of deliberation in faraway places. Our problems, as well as our solutions, are seen as emanating from abroad. Now, what the banner essentially tries to assert is the autonomy of Africa. Africa telling itself and the world that it's capable of analyzing its problems, of understanding its problems, and of finding solutions to those problems. And now, obviously, Africa is not an island, and we live in an increasingly interconnected world. And so the African solutions to African problems idea does not mean that the rest of the world does not have a role. It just means that Africa owns its problems, Africa owns the solutions, and Africa wants to lead that process. But support and engagement, an exchange of experiences and ideas with the rest of the world is critical. And in a way, of course, the West has often struggles, and not just the West, but the international community, whether it's the West or the East or Russia, or increasingly the Middle East, Gulf countries, they have tried to carve out their regions of influence on the continent, which undermine the capacity of the African Union to find solutions to the problems it faces. And so, there's still, I think the African Union, again, has the ambition to implement the idea of African solutions to African problems, but it still needs to strengthen itself. It still needs to make sure that its member states believe it and act on it, right? And so whenever there are problems, they should go to the African Union rather than to their patrons abroad, whether it's in China or in Europe or Russia or elsewhere. So basically, I think the expectation should not just be on the West and the East and the Gulf nations. The main expectation is on Africans themselves to tell ourselves and live under the idea of African solutions to African problems. If our countries look outwards, then that undermines the African Union and the idea of African solutions to African problems. And so the external world, the foreign world, needs to respect Africa, but Africans, most importantly, must respect themselves and believe the African Union in finding the solutions that arise within the continent.
Well, Adem, I'm going to ask you two critical topics. That's the Agenda 2063 and the African Free Trade Continental Area. Of course, previously you have read a little about African Free Trade Continental Area, but let me hear from you once again, like what do you reflect against or toward these topics about Agenda 2063 and the African Free Trade Continental Area? Some people say like Agenda 2063 is ambitious and realistic and so on and so forth. But let me hear from you. Is that realistic? Is that not ambitious? Let me hear from you.
Well, I think people are right. If you look at the Agenda 2023, it's a blueprint. It's essentially it tries to capture the vision, the mission of Africa, of today, but also of tomorrow. And so they are right to say that it's ambitious. And I think, as some say, if your ambitions don't scare you, they are not good enough. And so in that sense, the African Union has set out what it wants to achieve. And I think the expectation, the burden is now on us to try and help realize those. So yes, they are ambitious, but they are also necessary. And I think they are doable. We still have about 40 years to go. And if you've looked at the history of, for instance, East Asia, they have managed to pull themselves out of poverty, and to catapulted themselves into prosperity, from third to first world. And so I think, it is achievable. It is achievable, but it requires a lot of work. And I think that's where we should focus. What should we do to achieve that? And I think the African Continental Free Trade Area is central to the achievement of their objective. So far, the African Union, since the 1990s, the Abuja Agreement, has been encouraging economic integration, free movement of people across the continent. But it had outsourced actual implementation to regional economic communities like the East African Community, the Southern African Development Community, and ECOWAS in the West. But what it has done now is that it has, for the first time, taken a genuinely continental approach to economic integration. And yes, it's ambitious, and its implementation has been slower than what we would like it to be, but there is also steady progress, bit by bit. We're going to get there, and I think the fundamentalness of the African Continental Free Trade Area lies beyond economics. I mean, economically, it's critical because at the moment Africa does not trade with itself, right? We often send something to a foreign country, and then another African country gets it from that country. Rather than going from one country to another directly, it has to go somewhere and then come back. And so you can imagine the economic costs, the costs for the climate, and all of that. And so economically, if it's implemented, it will be transformational. But most importantly, I think it will transform our politics. It will transform our democracies across the continent. Because if economically we are integrated, then every country will pay attention to what is happening to another country because it has economic interests. And so what that means is that we have to work together to strengthen the African Union, to address problems of corruption, to address problems of lack of rule of law, and to address problems of peace and security and democracy. And so it is a tremendous economic boom, but most importantly, it will transform Africa's politics and the way Africa sees itself. And so yes, it's ambitious. Yes, we've been slow in implementing it, but it is something that is achievable. But it just requires deep commitment from our leaders, but also from the business community, from civil society, from intellectuals across Africa.
What does it mean for Ethiopia hosting the African Union Assembly here at the capital, Addis Ababa?
Well, I mean, obviously, the African Union is in Addis Ababa for a reason. It's a recognition of the historical role of His Excellency Haile Selassie in bringing the various factions, the various ambitions for continental integration in the early 1960s. And continuously, Ethiopia has also been central to pushing the idea of African integration, the Africa of bringing the continent together throughout. Regardless of the regimes that Ethiopia has had, we have been committed to the cause of Africa. And so in that regard, I think there is continuity. And so it's a recognition of its historical role, and it's also a recognition of its role as a supporter of the idea of African unity. So it's a blessing, but it's also an expectation. It's also a burden. We have to, as a country, show Africa and the world that we are capable of fulfilling the ambitions of the African Union, of solving our problems peacefully, of building our democracies, of respecting fundamental rights and the rule of law, and also of contributing to the idea of a peaceful region and a peaceful continent. And so I think it is a burden in the sense that we have to prove ourselves worthy of hosting the African Union by democratizing our discourse, by strengthening our peace and security, by working hard to create inclusive prosperity, and also by supporting our neighbors in the immediate region, but also the continent in achieving its objectives. So yes, it's a recognition, but it's also an expectation. And I think our leaders in particular must recognize Now, when I say our leaders, it's not just those who are in political power, but also the public intellectuals and all. They must recognize the expectation of hosting the African Union, of being the capital of Africa, through supporting democratization, economic inclusion, and peaceful resolution of our differences.
Well done, Adam. I have already finished my question for now, but let me give you a chance for you if you have any message you'd like to deliver for those who are watching this program around the world.
Well, I think so. The hope is that so far there's a lot of criticism that the African Union is a talk shop. It is a club of big men talking to each other, protecting each other. And what I hope will come out of this is a genuine commitment to transform the African Union into a union of rules, of a union of the people of Africa. And that, of course, requires commitments from each individual country. And so I hope that we will start to get commitments, centers of power getting committed to the objectives of the African Union. And also, I hope that in 2023, we'll start to reverse the trend of democratic decline. As you may have read the recent report of the Mo Ibrahim governance index, and it's extremely concerning. For the last 7 or 8 years, security, democratization, respect for fundamental rights have declined each year. And so what I hope is that the decisions and the deliberations that we will have in Addis Ababa this year will set the tone for changing the course and starting to improve the trajectory of economic improvement, of democratic improvement, and of course good governance in Africa.
Well done, Adam, from Netherlands Hague, for your detailed explanation. I hope we'll see you some other time. We'll raise several similar topics next time. Thank you, sir.
I really appreciate for having me. Thank you.
Well, viewers, this concludes the program I have produced in connection with the 36th ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union. For that, I met Adem Kassie. He is a senior advisor in the Peace and Constitution Building as the International Institute for Democracy and the Electoral Assistant based in Netherlands. Hague is also a vice president of the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers. I'd like to appreciate his description and explanation on the topic I've raised. I'd like to say once again, thank you. But for those who are arriving here in Addis Ababa for attending the Assembly of the African Union, please welcome. This concludes my program. I am Wadayo Muluna. Until I come yet with another topic and issue next time, do please stay with other programs of ATV. But for now,